Everybody, and welcome back to another YouTube video. So in this vlog I decided that I'll do something a little bit different to usual and walk you through how I personally structure an effective training session, in this case a pull session or a posterior session, which includes my back, hamstrings, as well as a couple of other smaller muscle groups, the calves and the rear delts. Now the following considerations that I'll be walking you through are the exact ones that I use whenever I'm structuring a training block for myself or any one of my clients. The first order principle being the initial consideration on that list. So a 2012 comparative study actually looked at the effects of exercise order on maximal strength and hypertrophy outcomes in resistance trained individuals. And what they concluded was that when prescribed appropriately alongside other important variables, things like load or weight on the bar, volume, rest intervals, etc., that exercise order can influence the efficiency, safety, and effectiveness of the overall training session or program. Therefore, irrespective of whether the exercise in question involves larger or smaller muscles, exercise order should largely and predominantly be governed by the underlying priority of that training session or the entire program itself. So for my situation, or in my case, my top priority for this session was firstly calf development, then hamstrings, and finally back development. So it is for that reason that in this specific session I've organized the body parts to run in such an order, doing my calves first, then my hamstrings, and following it up lastly with a small amount of back work as well as some rear delt work, which is simply just thrown in here for personal preferences. I do prefer to train it on back day, and this is simply to maintain the pre-existing tissue that I have in both of those muscle groups, or at the absolute most, develop them at a very ever so slow rate in comparison to the other body parts, which are more of a priority of mine. In order to specifically target the calves and do so as effectively as possible though, you should include at the least one standing variation and one seated variation at some point throughout the entire week of your training program if possible. Now the reason for this is because although both of the calf muscles do insert and attach below the ankle onto the foot, effectively acting on the ankle, the gastrocnemius originates from the upper portion of the leg above the knee, whereas the soleus actually originates from the lower portion of the leg below the knee. This means that the gastrocnemius acts on both the knee and the ankle joint, whereas the soleus only acts on the ankle. So if you were to do one variation, then one of the muscles which makes up the calves will suffer to some degree as a result of that. And even though the soleus is located beneath the gastrocnemius, it is the larger of the two muscles and therefore has a greater potential for growth from training. And so for that reason on its own, it's probably wise to have a little bit more work that specifically targets the soleus, which would be a seated variation. However, I would like to point out that on my lower body session towards the end of the week, I do have a seated calf raise variation in there exactly for that reason, to ensure that I tick that box. Now when it comes to hamstrings, it is a muscle group comprised of three different muscles, one of which contains two individual heads. We have the semimembranosus, the semitendinosus, the biceps femoris long head, and the biceps femoris short head. All four of these muscles cross the knee joint, therefore act on the knee joint. However, only three of them cross the hip joint, which means that one of them does not act on the hip joint. So in order to effectively train the hamstrings, we want to select movements which train knee flexion in isolation, hip extension in isolation, or both of these actions together. An RDL will train both of these actions, hip extension and knee flexion, whereas a leg curl of any variation will only train knee flexion. So when it comes to training hamstrings, I like to firstly perform a seated hamstring curl, seeing as this allows me to get a good mind to muscle connection with the hamstrings themselves. And I also get the most amount of localized tension in the hamstrings from doing so, as it places three of the heads of the hamstring in a greater stretch when shortening the muscle at the knee. This also helps me to reduce the amount of load that I require on my second hamstrings movement, a Romanian deadlift, and allows me to reach muscular failure much sooner, while also helping limit some fatigue that I would otherwise accumulate. For many beginner and intermediate athletes, I would not recommend doing this. However, for advanced athletes like myself, who are exceptionally strong on Romanian deadlifts and are very proficient with the movements, or for individuals who have pre-existing injuries or just a high propensity for hurting themselves, then I would definitely recommend structuring your hamstring training with a hamstring curl variation before your hip hinge movement, followed by a secondary hamstring curl variation. For myself, I start with the seated hamstring curl, then I go into the Romanian deadlift before finishing my hamstrings training with a lying hamstring curl variation, which places a greater emphasis on the biceps femoris short head, seeing as it places the hip in more extension. Now lastly, we have my back training. Due to my back being one of my hyper-responsive body parts, I like to limit my overall back training volume to 6 or 9 working sets per week for the entire training block. 4 to 6 sets in this session here, and then 2 to 3 sets in my second session that I hit my back on, which is my upper body session later in the week. Now when it comes to training back, we can simplify it by splitting it up into 3 major muscles: the trapezius muscles, the rhomboids, and the lats. Of course, there are other muscles such as the teres minor, the teres major, the spinal erectors, etc. that are all part of the back essentially, although these are the 3 big hitters in my opinion, and provided that you are at least hitting these 3 with a variety of pulling variations, your back development will be largely covered. So when we look at the actions of these 3 muscles that I just mentioned, we effectively have shoulder flexion and extension, scapular protraction and retraction, scapular depression and elevation. So in order to cover these, I always like to include some form of horizontal pulling movement, either a seated row or a chest supported row, a vertical pulling movement, either a pull up or a pull down, and a shoulder extension movement, something like a machine pullover or a cable lat pullover, or even a dumbbell pullover, although that isn't that ideal. Of course, if your back is a weak point though, then you should definitely identify which specific muscle within the back is contributing largely to it being a weak point, and then figure out which actions that muscle or those muscles are involved in, and ensure that you are doing at least 1 to 3 movements that specifically target the actions of those muscles, and preferably also petition those exercises toward the beginning of your training session, seeing as it is the priority of your training session. And last but not least, I've also included some direct rear delt work in this session. Now, I know what you're probably going to say, the rear delts are part of the shoulder and not the back, so why have you included it in your pulling day? Well, there's 2 main reasons. The first one being that I've always likened the actions of the rear delt head to be more akin to that of the back musculature as opposed to the other heads of the shoulder. And secondly, I just simply prefer to train the different heads of the shoulders on separate days so that I can place a greater level of attention and emphasis on each individual head and get better overall development. However, it is not a top priority of mine, which is why it is petitioned toward the end of the training session. So there you have it, guys. That is the reasoning behind the way that my training session is structured at the moment, and it gives you a little bit of insight into how I go through the entire thought process of setting up and structuring one's training session or training block. Now, if you did enjoy the video, guys, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below letting me know if you learned anything or if you found this video useful and in what way. And if you would like to see more content in the future, please don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell icon so you get updated and notified of new uploads. And until the next video, guys, I hope you stay safe, enjoy, and I will see you soon.